Now, Francis wants us to open up to new things. Francis is the new thing. He's not new because he leads a corrupt curia. We've had corrupt cardinals and popes before. He's not new because he voices error. Popes have done that before. He's not new because many are not even sure if he's the Pope or not. That has happened before. But this bishop in white is new because he's trying to destroy Catholicism. That has never happened before. St. Teresa of Calcutta said, "Give until it hurts." Now, resist until it hurts. God is willing to part the seas for his people.
Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is an interview between myself and Father Mawdsley. He is a priest who was ordained into the Fraternity of St. Peter, has found himself in some controversy, and that has to do a lot with his resistance to some of the COVID mandate stuff, his opinions that I believe are correct on the approach that the church needs to take with liturgy. He has an astonishing life. We talked about so much in this interview, everything from his time being in solitary confinement in Burma, fighting for justice for persecuted peoples there before he was a priest, his sort of interior conversion towards the Catholic priesthood, his love of the traditional Latin Mass, the wealth of the scriptures and what they show us about the traditional Latin Mass, the church's position on Judaism and the Jews, the bishop's response to the COVID lockdowns, the SSPX, true obedience, evolution, and more. We talked about absolutely everything. This is one of the greatest interviews I think I've ever had the pleasure of being a part of. So I hope you enjoy that, and be sure to click the links in the description to this video to see where you can find Father Mawdsley's work, because he is a priest. He has much more to say that you should be listening to than someone like me, and we should all support him, and all his books are available there, and you can support him in those various ways. Click the links in the description. It's very clear where you need to click to help Father Mawdsley. Okay, enough of me talking. Enjoy the show. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure of sitting down virtually across the pond with Father Mawdsley, who is a traditional Catholic priest with many interesting things to say about the Mass, the history of the Mass as seen in Scripture and tradition. He does have some wonderful stories to tell us about trying to navigate the so-called pandemic as a traditional Catholic priest in, I believe it was Germany and Austria. We'll get to that. He's the author of 4 books, which I'm just going to put on the screen here, just so we can all see them. You can see these are right here. If you believed Moses, and Crucifixion to Creation, Crushing Satan's Head, and Adam's Deep Sleep. Personally, I have read a portion of Adam's Deep Sleep. I haven't finished it yet, but I can tell that it is a depth of scholarship, and it did remind me, Father, maybe you've read the book, How Christ Said the First Mass by Father Meagher. It had a lot of that sort of depth to it. There's so much, which we'll get into, but there's so much about the actual liturgy that was part of Christ's ministry, especially the Last Supper, which, it turns into this, almost stereotypical painting. They're sitting around eating pita bread, and that's the Last Supper, but there's just so much more to it. Anyway, I don't want to talk too long because you'll explain it better than I do. So, Father, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Okay, so I know your background. We did meet briefly at the Catholic Identity Conference, and we did share a cigar outside the hotel. I remember that. And you had a history of, let's call it, human rights advocacy or something like that, actually even spent time in prisons in Burma, if I'm not mistaken. Would you like to tell us kind of the Coles notes of who Father Mawdsley is and how that came about, and eventually how you became a Catholic priest?
Sure. I grew up in Lancashire, England. My mother's Australian. Very happy childhood where I had a Burmese friend since I was 13, and he would tell me about the injustice in his country in ways that neither of us could properly process because we were so young. But it stuck with me, and that led me to going out to Burma when I was in my 20s. I was arrested. I've never called it human rights advocacy, because even back then, you can see there's something wrong with this whole system that's built on no foundation except what man asserts. the proper foundation for human dignity is that we're made in the image of God, and that our Lord, the second person of the Trinity, took on human nature fully, which shows that human nature is capable of being united with the divinity. That's our destination. That's amazing. And so see the people in Burma being robbed of their goods by their government and crushed, and the most cruel tortures. The world doesn't make sense so long as this is happening anywhere. I know it's happened through all history, and it's happened pretty much everywhere, even in basements in Austria, the terrible things that a father is doing to imprisoning his own family for more than a decade. You know, if we don't deal with this question of evil, then basically I don't see how you can settle down to a peaceful life. However, that doesn't mean we need to be constantly combating evil. I think someone who's going to worship the living God is doing the very best thing they can to deal with the evil. It took me a few imprisonments to discover that.
A few imprisonments. So you were in prison in Burma, is that true?
Yeah.
Okay. And that was, I mean, you just sort of were standing up to the regime in your own way. Is that kind of the context?
Right. And it did have these, if you will, intermediary political goals, and simply a matter of loving your neighbor who's suffering. But it was also a pursuit of this deeper truth of how can human beings be so cruel to each other? Where does evil come from? And it's not as if there's actually two kinds of people. It's in all of us, which again, the Catholic teaching that we need to fight our own sin is absolutely on the nose. That's where it begins. And it doesn't end either. You don't get past that phase. That's a constant thing all our life. But by fighting your own sin, that will bring you into confrontation with evil in the world, for example. If you're fighting your cowardice, you need to learn to stand up to injustice, for example, as we saw the last 3 years.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned having to confront the evil as something formative on basically an understanding of how the world could even be right and how you could have peace in the world, because that's one of the reasons why Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson is so famous. You know, I have a love-hate with Peterson. I do have to admit that when I was reverting to the Catholic faith in 2014, 2015, providentially, I did discover his lectures. I am here in southwestern Ontario, and he taught at the University of Toronto, which is 2.5 hours from me. So he was on public access television, things like that. So before he was famous, I was a Peterson fan, if that makes sense. I was before the bandwagon. But I did watch his lectures. He just taped himself in class. And obviously, a lot of things he says are not reconcilable with Catholic tradition. A lot of the Jungian philosophy, although there are elements of truth in it, it does borderline on Gnosticism. However, one of the things that he does tease out, which I think people find so helpful, is dealing with the devil within, so to speak, and having to confront that, even just to have sanity. And that quest for sanity, for example, did drive Chesterton towards the church, towards God in the first place. So that's a huge aspect of it. Now, were you raised as a Catholic, nominally or faithfully, or any of the sort?
My mother was a faithful Catholic and took us all as kids to church every Sunday. My brothers and I learned to serve the Mass when we were little. However, it was the Novus Ordo. And in our teenage years, my mum, she stopped coming to the Mass, stopped taking us. She said that when she was a girl, they were told, oh, the Mass will never change. Nobody can change the Mass. And she remembers always her great aunts, her 3 great aunts, praying the rosary, which she loved to do with them. When all the changes came in the 70s, it was totally disorientating for her. And then when a couple of calamities came in her life, she couldn't, basically, she no longer had the Mass to sustain her. But thanks be to God, although my mother had a very good death in 2014, but she came back to the faith in the last 2 years, back to the sacraments in the last 6 months. In the last 6 weeks, the rosary was never out of her hand, and she received the last rites. So thanks be to God for all that. I don't think she would have enjoyed the pandemic because she would have seen that it was complete nonsense. So she had an escape there.
Well, I live in Canada, which was, Australia got all the headlines because, and I have a theory about that. We had the exact same rules. Like if you actually looked at the legislation, it was the same thing. But I think it was a difference in seasons. So everyone was locked down at the same time here in the Northern Hemisphere, the winter lockdowns, summer openings, that kind of thing. And whereas Australia was locking down when we were all open. I think that's honestly, I thought, I'm like, we have pastors getting arrested. We have protests and clashes with police. Not that I'm saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's happening. But everyone thought Australia was the worst place in the world. And I think partly it's just because they needed some news. And when everybody else was locked down, it wasn't really news because everyone was going through it. Okay, so maybe we should jump into there, because you were ordained if I'm not mistaken, you were ordained into the fraternity of the St. Peter, correct?
Yeah.
So what made you decide to be a traditional Catholic priest rather than just a Novus Ordo Catholic priest? Thank you for watching this show. If I could just interrupt this wonderful conversation for just a moment here, please check the links out in the description for the TKR store. You can find there our sacred frankincense oil, which we've brought in straight from the Middle East, and you can also find our lanolin balm. And these are just two of the products that we have so far. There is a special product or a special series of products coming soon. The goal here is to offer you things that you're looking to buy anyway, but you can buy them from somebody who has the same values as you. If you can't shop locally, at least you can, in a way, support people with similar values. Check the links in the description. The TKR store, it's easy to find. Now back to the show.
I felt a very clear call to the priesthood in 2005, which very much surprised me, but it was very clear. So I set off on the Novus Ordo path because that's all that I knew, and tried out a religious society and also a diocese. But I discovered corruption in the religious society after a year and a half, and within 24 hours, I'd got from Spain to Rome to confront them at the General House, and then I was back in London, or 36 hours. It was out of order. And then with the diocese, at the end, they said I couldn't kneel to receive Holy Communion, and I just knew that it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And at the same time, then I was discovering online about the traditional Mass. Thanks a lot to Father Z, and then reading more and more about it. And then I'd attended a few traditional Masses, and then it's like, no looking back, can't live without this. And that diocese in England had said to me, you will not be able to have formation in the traditional Mass in this seminary. So it's a non-starter. A lot of seminarians think that they can keep their head down for 7 years, and once they're ordained, they're going to break out and do it. There's no way that's going to happen. They will have spent 7 years learning how to submit to unjust orders. You can't just switch that off. And in fact, it gets harder and harder to stand out against the system the longer you've been complying with it. It's much easier when you've got nothing to lose. When you're a little fish, that's when you should resist the system. Or God gives an awakening to people sometimes who are in a position of influence, and let them take that opportunity. But so long as we have an awareness that the system is corrupt, we shouldn't be complying with it. It will only get harder to fix later.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. When they instituted mask mandates here, so I wore a mask maybe half a dozen times for reasons of I had to go to the dentist. There was just no way they'd let me in, and my benefits were going to run out, and I needed to get my teeth cleaned. At hospital, they wouldn't let you in. There was no way. I think they'd probably sedate you and throw one on you, if you didn't put one on. They were very serious. But I never wore one at stores or anything like that. I only had a couple confrontations. Was able to navigate through it, and I remember speaking with some, traditional Catholic friends and people I go to church with and stuff, and I would say, "Come on, guys, let's take them off." If we all take them off, they can't make us all wear them. It's true. They showed that with the Freedom Convoy. As soon as there was enough of a stink, it's like, oh, I guess the science has changed. It's like, yeah, right. Yeah. But they said, well, I'm saving my strength for the big fight. I'm saving my strength and I said, that's not how it works. Just a similar analogy. I used to be a little bit of an amateur boxer. You can't just not practice the fundamentals and then say I'll be okay for the real fight. You have to do everything up to the lead up. Yeah,
that's about the line in winter. You practice during the winter, so when the season comes, you can fight.
Yeah.
And with the one thing I learned about Burma is it really is no good waiting for the mass movement, waiting for other people to act. Mm-hmm. When your conscience stirs you, that's when you should act. And you don't know if you're going to be in one of the front runners or one of the crowd or one of the stragglers. It doesn't matter. You do it when your conscience calls you. But there's nothing more likely to inspire other people to stand up to tyranny than seeing other people do it.
Yep.
So you can't just whip people up and organize them. Just do what's right, and that will have its good knock-on effects and fruit.
There is wisdom there, you say, as well. Don't wait until, the seminarians who try to wait until they're ordained to finally do something. The small fish idea of when you're insignificant, so to speak, then do something. And I can relate to that. I'm 35 and I was beginning a teaching career. I was about 7 years in. Here in Ontario, teaching is actually similar to the UK. It's a desirable job. It's not like the sort of public school teaching in the States where it's very low pay. It's actually quite desirable. Good benefits, good summers off and all that sort of stuff. It's a really good family life thing. Spent a lot of money getting a degree to do it and all that kind of stuff. And then I realized in the first few years of teaching, I was teaching in a Catholic school. There was heresy and nonsense. And I would, like you, I'd write letters to the chancery or similar things and talk to the religious education formators and stuff and cause them headaches. And I basically realized at a certain point, I said, if I stay in this, then one of two things is going to happen. I'm either going to become bitter and resentful and just hate my job, which is no good because I've got children to raise and a wife to keep happy. On the other hand, if I bend the knee, then I'll have, basically compromised with something I know to be wrong. And those two outcomes were just not desirable. So I made the decision to get out before I was 20 years in. And, thankfully I'm young enough in the earliest part of my adulthood that I can transition to a new career. But if I had waited 10 to 15 years, how much more difficult would it have been at that point? Yeah.
I look back at what I did in Burma and I don't believe I could do anything like that now, unless God really sent the circumstances. I mean, I picked a fight then because I was ready for it. But now I'm 50. I don't have the energy for that. And so the whole thing that's happening now in the church and with Traditionis Custodes and Francis, although I think it's necessary to resist him and his evil, it's not a fight I picked. This is something that's come to us. The pandemic and Traditionis Custodes took away my ministry.
Why don't you explain that for us, because you were a priest. Now you must speak German, right?
I'm English Australian, but I was posted. I went to seminary in Germany because when you
you did learn German
to join the fraternity or to say the traditional mass. There's not many options in the world for a seminary,
right?
And the fraternity are fantastic. I love them, and it's either go to Denton or in Nebraska or Vigeratsbad in Bavaria. And I have German roots as well, kind of. And I've been so many times to America. I love America. I thought I got to get to know Europe. So I went there.
And that's where you learned German?
I'm still flailing. After 10 years in German-speaking countries, it's embarrassing. Theoretically, I can get by. But
so when you would offer Mass, though, would you do your homilies in German?
Yeah. So it wasn't so much an education for the faithful as a penance for them. And but they were all very kind. They say they can understand me. And in fact, the advantage of it was I spoke like a 5-year-old. When you give your homilies like a 5-year-old, it works. And in fact, one family asked their little children, like really, the under 10s, of the 3 priests in one of the apostolates, whose homilies do you like the best out of our priests? Now, the other 2 priests are very, very well educated. They do great homilies, but they like mine the best because they could understand. Yeah. So,
I'm, as you know, and most people who watch this know, I'm a Society of St. Pius X attendee and obviously a defender. And there's an expression, maybe it's similar into the fraternity, I don't know, but in the SSPX, if you want to join the SSPX to see the world, I know just here in our area, so we had a priest named Father McGilvery who's been on the SSPX podcast a bunch, very intelligent man, and he doesn't speak a lick of French. He did speak Spanish. He went to spend time in Mexico. Doesn't speak a lick of French. Went to the American seminary, gets sent to English-speaking Canada, and then they sent him to Quebec, to the heart of Quebec, where there's no English spoken at all, and he has to learn how to teach in the school within like 2 months. And then they sent Father Perot, who's from the south of France, to our chapel where no one speaks French and he didn't speak a lick of English. And it's just, You know, and it's amazing how fast they can learn. I mean, it's with a lot of Rosetta Stone and struggling through things, and within 4 or 5 months they can hear confessions and things, and it seems to be a common experience amongst traditional priests.
You know, one of the most diabolical attacks facing tradition is what Rome may soon attempt to do with the seminaries. And I recall under John Paul II or Benedict, they said one of the criteria for their seminaries, the ideal that Rome wants, is that they be international. And look at the traditional seminaries, like for the Institute or the SSPX or the fraternity. They are so international. You have so many nations there. And there are so many languages spoken there that really the only way you are going to have a notice board that can handle it is by having it in Latin.
Yep.
So this is the wisdom of the church. It works. And yet Rome is going to accuse the traditional seminaries of giving an inadequate formation. They basically want an exegesis in the scriptures that denies the Catholic teaching. You know, the 4 senses of scripture is based on the literal sense, and
Yes.
there's this mania for the historical critical method, as if people never get beyond that now. They're not looking at the moral sense or the allegorical sense of the scriptures. It's just the papers coming out are all stuck on the historical method, which is interesting and important because the literal sense is the foundation. But there's no point to it if you're not going to move on to learn the mysteries that God wants to reveal to us through the scriptures. And if you go to diocesan seminaries, it's very rare that you get enough exposure to the fathers and the scholastics to be able to understand the Bible at all. And to think that Rome are going to attack the tradi seminaries, this is so grave, it's so serious. I hope, God will help us. God will help us.
It was interesting you mentioned not being able to understand the Bible. I know in the diocese I'm in, the fella who I believe he was or still is in charge of vocations for the diocese, I know for a fact that coming out of seminary, he had never read the book of Exodus. Just hadn't read it. It was never part of or he was able to skirt by. And I mean, how can you understand, maybe we can transition here to talking about what is the Mass really, because how could you understand what the Mass is if you don't understand the divinely revealed understanding of liturgy in the scriptures?
There's a dozen times that Moses passes on to Pharaoh what God told him, and Aaron and Moses went to Pharaoh and said, we will be leaving this place in order to worship God.
Yeah.
And it's in the Benedictus as well. The reason for freedom, even political freedom or social freedom, any freedom, is in order to worship God. And in fact, that's the criteria for maintaining your freedom. If you're not exercising yourself to worship God, you won't have freedom. And that comes through in Exodus, the whole of it. And the whole building of the tabernacle, which is a preparation for the incarnation, for Jesus coming among us, but also it's that place of encounter with God. And in the tabernacle, you have the menorah, the light, you have the bread of presence on the tables, the altar of incense, and all these things speak to Holy Mass, the bread for the Eucharist, the light. There has to be light on the altar at Mass, or you shouldn't say the Mass. Because the first words of creation are about the light, right, which is Christ. He's the light of the world. Basically, Exodus. Can't live without it.
So maybe let's discuss then, because in your books, which again, ladies and gentlemen, they are available in the show notes for this video. You can find there's a link for them there. And I suggest you read them. I know that I have Adam's Deep Sleep on Kindle, so you have Kindle version as well of your books. So we talked briefly about the book by Father Meagher called How Christ Said the First Mass. That one you can find used copies for like $150, but you can also find it on archive.org. I read it electronically, most of it. I haven't read the whole thing, but most of it. And one of the things I learned coming away from that book, and for a little context about it, it was a priest, a Jesuit, a good Jesuit, during the time of St. Pius X. He wrote basically an exhaustive study on the liturgical history of both the Jewish history leading into the Christian history. And he spent a lot of time in the Holy Land going over the significance of all of the rites of worship of the Old Covenant. And he was an expert in languages and things like that. He had many historical analogies and references in there that are just absolutely astonishing to explain it. One of the things I took away reading that book is that the Mass does not go back only 2,000 years. It goes back to the beginning of time. And this is one of the themes that you tease out. Could you explain that for us?
Yeah. In fact, the Mass is so rich that it would have been almost impossible to bring that about in a generation, or let's say in the 2 or 3 years of Jesus' public ministry, training up his apostles. The idea of priesthood and sacrifice and altar, it needed a long, more than a cultural preparation. It's kind of deeper than that into our understanding of man and our search for God. So the whole Garden of Eden, in fact, is a setup that is originally a kind of an image of heaven, the paradise, but also within there, the centrality of that tree, which is the cross, from which is life. The man and the woman coming from the man's side as the church came from Jesus' side on the cross with his pierced heart and the blood and the water. In fact, before animals were sacrificed, before there was sin, before there was death, what was there to offer to God but fruit? So although it's likely Adam fell on the first day, which is quite embarrassing for mankind, but
yes, it is.
None of us are surprised, right, who sin. I find it bizarre that people blame Adam and Eve. And I think, well, if you can go one day without slipping, even in your thoughts, then you can blame Adam and Eve. But in any case, there's fruit, and the fruit, we talk of the flesh of the fruit, right, and the blood of the grape. If you squeeze it, you get the juice. So even then you have this flesh and blood, which could be offered to God as a sacrifice of thanksgiving and praise, if not for atonement before sin. And then in the second generation, Abel is offering his lamb. And the lamb, well, got one here. Where is it? It's key to the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Look at his mouth of the lamb. I don't know which way to point. I don't know if it's mirroring or not. The lamb is silent when it's being persecuted, when it's being taken to slaughter, as Isaiah said, and the deacon Philip interpreted. And Cain offered grain. So again, you have grain and the lamb, which are both actually Eucharistic. They point to the Eucharistic. Yeah. But Cain did something. It wasn't his goods that were unworthy. It was the manner of the offering, or that he offered the second best stuff, or something else. But everything there is pointing to the Eucharist. In fact, it tells the Genesis 1, I think, tells us about bdellium being in the land, which only occurs in one other place in the Bible. And it's about the manna from heaven in the book of Exodus that had the taste of like sweet coriander, but the color of bdellium. And so again, it's a connection with the Holy Eucharist, that it's all laid up there in the land in the beginning. So, and that's just looking at Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, but all through with Abraham and Isaac, or with Moses in the tabernacle, or with Solomon in the temple, it's all a preparation for Mass. The priesthood took a long time to develop the priesthood. You know, that with the high priesthood and the different families and the singers and the porters. Like if you read Chronicles, and it's talking again and again about the porters and their different orders, and it names so many of them, and the singers and Asaph. These are essential to worship. So Holy Mass is meant to be sung. The whole of it is meant to be sung. And a low Mass is a concession to practicality. But our hearts should be singing, right? Because in heaven, everything is sung. The angels sing. That's how they communicate. So basically, the more we discover the roots of the Mass in the Old Testament, I believe, then the more stable we are from the attacks on it. You know, in the Cultural Revolution in China in 68, they're trying to destroy the four olds. They're trying to destroy history. We see that with BLM. They want to destroy history, tear down the statues. Because once you've destroyed a people's sense of history, that you can manipulate them anywhere. If they don't know where they've come from, they can't possibly know where they're going. So our stability depends upon having tradition. Reaching our goal depends upon having tradition. You know who you are, where you've come from, where you're going. And that all goes back to, well, really Jesus and Mary on Calvary, and Adam and Eve are an explanation of what was happening on Calvary. Because Jesus and Mary are really the center of it, the real beginning. And God wrote it, so much of it, like a preview heading up to that, so that we could understand it is from God. Once we see how the Bible is written, that God tells us several times in the Bible, he's the one that sees things that are near and far, tells things in advance that men can't even dream of, so that we know it's from him. And that gives us such a peace that this couldn't be concocted by human beings.
It's interesting. There's two things that I want to bring up there that made me think of important facts. First, Cain and Abel. I gave a talk on the new mass last summer, just to my chapel, and it was maybe 50, 100 people or something. And I was going through this work from Father Meagher, but I was really contemplating, and I don't know where I heard this idea. Personally, I think when you spend enough time in tradition and reading traditional theology, and just sort of get recalibrated, if that makes sense, I think you just start to understand the things without them having to be explained to you. I never really heard this idea of Cain and Abel that I'm going to explain in a second here anywhere else. This is not to say it's my novel idea. I think it's just a traditional thing that's imbibed once you understand truly that the Mass is a sacrifice. You can't see the scriptures apart from that lens. And when I was reading through the story of Cain and Abel, I realized you're exactly correct. It's not that Cain didn't offer a technically valid sacrifice. It's that he offered an unworthy sacrifice. Yeah. And there was a metaphysical reason. There was a interior reason. So to me, validity is not enough. Validity is a very low bar. I mean, it's very simple. The priest says a few words with proper intention. Very easy to manifest that over the matter, and you have a valid consecration of the Eucharist. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the example of a priest consecrating a whole bakery. Be inadvisable, but technically could be valid. And that's not, the validity is the low bar. Everything that surrounds the sacrifice, even if the thing is valid, can, in my opinion, maybe you can elaborate on this, in a sense, kind of make or break whether God accepts that or not. So when people say, what's the issue with going to the Novus Ordo? Okay, technically a priest performs a valid consecration, assuming the certain parts of his intention, form, matter, etc. are there. But there's so much more to it than that. And, maybe I'm reaching here, but is there something to be said about that?
Absolutely right. And validity is not, love wants a lot more than validity. If we love God, we cannot be satisfied with validity, although we would be horrified not to have that.
Right.
It's certainly not enough. And, we're told in the Book of Wisdom that Cain perished. He went to hell. It's in the context of salvation. He went to hell. He was sorrowful after the murder of Abel, not because of what he had done, but out of self-pity. He murdered his brother because his brother's sacrifice was better. Now, first, this is about the Jews crucifying Jesus, their brother, whose sacrifice is better. He's the Lamb of God, the shepherd. But it's become now about within the church, the corrupt hierarchy, Sanhedrin, trying to put the traditional sacrifice to death. I think Cain is definitely all about the Novus Ordo. And it's strange when you have discussed something with diehard Novus Ordo people. It's not like we're accusing them of anything. We're talking about the difference of the rites. Yes. And yet they take it as a personal accusation. And they say, oh, you think you're better than us? I said, well, no, it never entered my head. I think the traditional Mass is infinitely better than the Novus Ordo. There are so many prayers in the traditional Mass before the consecration about asking God to accept what we're about to offer. And then after the consecration, begging him, like the Supplius de Regamus, to accept this.
Right.
So we know it's valid, but we're still asking God to accept it because the whole thing has to be done with love. I had the thought about Cain and Abel, but also about the fine points of the Mass. I don't want to forget either. With Cain and Abel, they went out to the field. That's where he murdered him. And there are other connections through the Bible with Jacob and Esau and Rebekah and Isaac that take place in the field. And they all end up pointing to Calvary. Well, that's in the book, The Crucifixion to Creation. But about the Mass, just thinking of the corporal, for example, and the burse, the way the priest folds the corporal is the same every single time, and he puts it into the burse. the same direction every time, and the burst should be laid on the chalice facing the tabernacle. So every priest basically knows how it's going to be. It's the same order, and it's all done to preserve the dignity of, if some particles of the host were in the corporal, they're going to be in the same place, in the same first fold, and they will be found the next day and put in the chalice. Now, you don't want that to happen.
No, but it's
it's
feel
far better
safe.
than not having a corporal or folding up the corporal willy-nilly, whatever. Or everything we have in the Mass, it's been stripped already, as it were, to its essentials, and yet it's full of these embellishments of love. At the same time, I think that's what I'm trying to say, that what we think are embellishments of love are also actually essential to the good of the worship of God, and vice versa. It's perfect. It's perfect. Since 1570. I'm sorry, I'm into a bit of a flow now, but with
That's okay.
People ask, one pope, he can't lay down legislation what other popes can do or not. So Pius V couldn't say in 1570 that no one can ban this Mass. That is such a legalistic, positive way of thinking, as if it's just about the law. But the Pope Pius V, the saint, is telling us something much more about the good of the Mass. It's like, woe to anyone who dreams of changing this, especially a bishop or a pope who tries to do that. They have lost the spirituality, the truth, if they even wish to change it. And then when they do, with Traditionis Custodes, try to forbid priests from offering the old Mass, they don't have a leg to stand on. Today's gospel from Friday and Holy Week is the end of Matthew's gospel, where Jesus gives the Great Commission. He's saying, go and observe everything whatsoever I have commanded. Now, this means we, in our ordination, we have our mission to do that, and no one can take it away, post-ordination or even from the church.
There's so much there. This is wonderful. And I'm thinking back to, so when I was doing that talk last year on the new Mass, I was looking through some of the works of Michael Davies, obviously an amazing scholar on the history of the liturgy and so forth. And one of the things I realized is that, you'll never find a time in history where a heretic doesn't, basically you always find a radical change to the Mass or the service along with a radical change to theology or the Bible. They're inextricably linked. You'll never find that a heretic also keeps the Mass totally the same. It may be for a transitionary period a little bit. Okay, in England it was pretty much the same for a bit, but even there it was part of the plan of Cranmer and so forth to, still play to their Catholic sensibilities, let them ease into this Church of England, then eventually lead the way to different changes. But it wasn't it was just a transitionary thing. With Luther, we're talking about here basically what we're saying is, and what you're saying for us is that in the Mass is divine revelation. The Mass is I want to use this term properly. It's almost like a theatrical, I know it's valid, but there's almost like a theater to it. It's like the scriptures are played out for us so that we can understand them with every single sense of our being.
Yeah.
Man having an immortal soul, we know things through the senses. So to keep things in our immortal soul, to keep the immaterial in the rational soul that makes us a human rather than just an animal, we have to take in knowledge, and it has to be part of who we are. And in order to do that, we have to learn these things through the senses. So we can look at the scriptures and read them, and that's obviously very important. But we can't understand the scriptures to the fullest unless we actually feel the scriptures and we taste the scriptures. I'm thinking about, I'll forget the prophet. Is it Elias or is it where he talks about eating the scriptures?
Might be Jeremiah.
Might be Jeremiah. Anyway, that's obviously, the scroll, eating the scroll. That's right. And it tastes like honey or something like that. I think there's some reference there. And obviously that's a prefigurement of the Eucharist to come, but it's also a prefigurement, in my opinion, of how the Eucharist will be eaten, how the Eucharist will be presented to us, because he's talking about eating the scroll. He's talking about consuming the sacred scriptures as if it's food. And there's just an inextricable link between proper understanding of the scriptures and proper understanding of Holy Eucharist. And when they changed the Mass, it's no wonder that the theology of the church changed. It's impossible. This is why people don't understand. The hermeneutic of continuity is a very difficult thing to try to validate, because you can't mix oil and water. You can't have something that is in contrast to all of tradition and mix it with something that is traditional. It's just not going to work.
Yeah. When I was quite little, I think it's amazing that we exist, that we can communicate, which indicates having intellect, understanding, but also that we can act in a sovereign way. We can decide to think this or think that, do this or do that. Even though there might be external limitations in ourselves, we have this amazing capability which should blow us away, which is the spark of the divine, even Trinitarian, that we are, that we can communicate ideas and that we can do and act together to achieve much more than one person acting alone. So existence has this amazing potential which reaches up to God. And so life on earth should also reflect this amazing potential. And the church realizes that. And in the Mass, we realize that, because it isn't enough to read the word. It's not living. The word is meant to be spoken, and the truth is something that's meant to be done. It's not enough to know the truth. It's something you do to live truly. Yeah. And so in the Mass, we see it's that alone which unites all generations, right back to Adam and Eve and to Abel. Abel lives. Abel's in heaven. Abel is at the banquet. He did well, and he's mentioned in every Mass. It's in the Mass that you come to Abel and you honor what he did. I had someone comment on my YouTube channel recently that Abel's life came to a big fat zero. And they said that Cain he repented and was forgiven and built a city. He did well. They've turned everything completely on its head. It's insane. You couldn't possibly think like that if you're going to weekly or daily Mass and you love the canon. So it's something we have to do, and the striving to do it is also what purifies and elevates society. It's now under attack for us. It has been for all time, since the murder of the prophets and then of Christ, and then the persecutions of the early church, the Reformation, everything we've seen since the Enlightenment. This is why we mustn't roll over to what Rome is trying to do now. We call it Rome. It's not enough to call it Francis or Cardinal Roche. It's much bigger than them. It's a cosmic battle that's happening. And it's appalling that our cardinals have gone over literally to the dark side, literally serving Satan's goals. They might not know that. You could perhaps argue they're of goodwill, but their goodwill and their infatuation is with the world, with the globalists, with pleasing them.
Well, I just want this. I don't want to move past this idea of the cosmos for a second here, because there's an idea about, and you can find this in Father Faber. Admittedly, I've not read the whole book. I've just read sort of essays and things about Father Faber's work, about the extent to which, if I'm going to say it properly, the precious blood extends into the cosmos, and actually puts right the material universe. This reminds me of one of the quotes attributed to Padre Pio. I think it's legitimate, where that it would be easier for the world to exist without the sun than without the Mass. Now, Padre Pio was talking about the old Mass, and he was talking about and obviously he would have assumed there was the Eastern liturgies, the traditional sacrificial offering of the Catholic Church. Why is it necessary for the sacrifice to continue and to happen worthily for the actual sustainability of the earth as we know it?
Well, the book you mentioned, Crucifixion to Creation, it begins talking about Aristotle and St. Thomas saying about divine wisdom. The architect who made the universe has laid the purpose of the universe into the foundation, because a wise architect doesn't just start building without a plan. Everything he does in the preparation, the gathering of materials, the choosing of the site is with the last goal in mind. He knows what building he wants to make.
Exactly.
So when God created the heavens and the earth and the separations and the filling and laid out the Garden of Eden, it's all to point to the goal of the universe, which is to bring us to the heavenly banquet, which is by means of Calvary and by Holy Mass. So if you remove Holy Mass, the universe loses its purpose. And the precious blood which flows in Mass truly it redeems the whole cosmos. I have Father Faber's book in one of my boxes. I've been moved so many times. After 4 months in this location, I've still not unpacked my boxes because I'm trained now. What is it like to think, oh, I'm going to be moved on? But it's glorious what he writes about the procession of the precious blood. And we have processions before Vespers, for example, before Mass. And I remember in the seminary, it would last quite a long time, and it's so impressive. It's beautiful. Also before an ordination, when there's lots of guest clerics, and the procession before and after goes on and on and on, and you have all these pairs of clerics coming, genuflecting to the Blessed Sacrament, going to their place. It's like it fits with the Litany of Saints, where you have all the grades and types of saints and so many names that you recognize. And this is a procession which should be endless in a way, because it talks about the procession of the precious blood. And Father Faber, the procession of the Holy Ghost, actually. But Father Faber talks about the procession of the precious blood through the whole cosmos, which is a delight to the angels, who are always there to praise it. And it's a delight to God the Father, who looks on this blood and keeps the universe in existence because of it. If it were not for it, why would God tolerate this filthy, corrupt creation, which the devil and we have spoiled with sin? It's because his blood pleads, looking at the end goal. He has the end result in mind. That's why he loves each one of us, even though we're a sinner. Yeah. He knows how we're going to end when he's worked on us, redeemed us, put us through the mill. And that's why, if you believe in your ability to heal as a doctor, and you're looking at someone that's sick, you don't quit or give up. You believe you can do this. And how much more God, who looks on us sinners, and he knows that by his blood, what did Jesus say? When an unclean thing touches the clean thing, it's the clean becomes defiled. But when it's with him, touching him, the holy thing, nothing can defile him.
Right.
It's he that makes holy that which comes into contact with him. So
I've never heard it explained so succinctly, but I'm thinking of the term telos, right? Or telos, the teleological end. It's a Greek word meaning, what is the end of a thing? Yeah. So you make this analogy of someone building a house or building a structure. Obviously, the end of that thing is in mind before it's created. So its end exists before its beginning.
Yeah.
Right.
And the final cause informs the efficient cause.
Right.
Although we think the efficient cause is the beginning of things because it gets things going. Thomas explains this as well. You can't have an efficient cause if there isn't already a final cause.
Right.
That's the cause of causes. It's the first thing because it's the last thing. As in, once you know the goal, everything else is laid out. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's perfect. And this is why Christ is the beginning and the end. It's not just some spiritual maxim. It's not just some ineffable expression. It's an actual philosophical statement of the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And this is why evolution, that we didn't, I didn't know I was going to bring this up, but this is why I can't stand the theory of evolution, because it's metaphysically bankrupt. It contains...
Watch your video.
Oh.
Fantastic. Everyone's got to watch it.
Thank you. Well, by the way, people, I forgot, Father does have a YouTube channel, which is linked in the description, and I will mention that in the introduction, but if you missed the introduction, Scripture and Tradition, you can find that on YouTube, and I'll link that in the show notes as well. But that evolution, there's no telos to it.
No, it's embarrassing.
It's an embarrassing, it's a metaphysical, it's a philosophical train wreck.
Yeah.
I was watching, there's this famous podcast. I've never watched one of the full episodes, but he gets like 10 million views. So it's recommended on YouTube. Okay. And it's Lex Friedman. He's like an MIT professor, very intelligent guy, but, very much a materialist, talking about science and these things. Some interesting clips because, you do a 3-hour podcast, you say some interesting things. But he did have this fella talking about AI on, and this guy is, another, quote unquote genius. And they were talking about mathematical models to try to prove evolutionary theory and how they all fail, but they were still explaining why there's still truth to evolutionary theory. And I was thinking, math has an end. You have it's ordered towards a calculation. Mm-hmm. And here you are, you guys are both literal mathematical geniuses. In fairness to them, they probably have bankrupt metaphysics, but I'm sure they're better than a calculator. But they still, because their philosophy is so bankrupt, they can't see right in front of them that their own baseline philosophy for why we exist is completely flawed. They still try to find the meaning in that, and they can't.
Yeah.
And this is, people will debate, okay, the age of the universe. I'm personally basically young earth creationist. I understand, though, it's not dogmatized, and there are ways to look at the days of creation. This is according to the Pontifical Biblical Commission and various authoritative sources at the time. I get it. It's not like, you must believe a certain amount of time. I get that. But nonetheless, evolution, I think, is completely anathematized by the Catholic faith. But when I look at the state of the Catholic Church nowadays, and I look at the state of conservative apologetics, let's call it, sort of mainline conservative, there's this desire on behalf of conservative Catholic apologists who are seemingly of goodwill. They won't deny any of the dogmas, and they'll express that transubstantiation is real and all these important aspects of the Apostles' Creed and so forth. But when it comes to evolution, they just can't help themselves but try to square that circle in order to appeal to the world. And it goes against what you're saying here, this teleological end of the universe. It's almost, maybe I could say this, evolution is almost against the theology of the Mass, if that makes sense.
It is, because the whole Eucharist is the source of all truth on earth. It is the fullness of being on earth. And it's the departure from the scholastic metaphysics prior to the Reformation that enabled the Reformation and the degeneration in philosophy since then. So the fact that we're appalled to see how brainwashed people were in the last 3 years to believe all the garbage they're being fed, and they can't critically think about things, is actually, we should have known that because there's a widespread acceptance of gay marriage and abortion. Clearly, people have lost their minds. But before that, a widespread acceptation of evolution, which is insane. It contradicts the principle of sufficient reason, which is one of 4 basic metaphysical principles, which there's no observed example of in all the history of mankind. And they talk about science. And yet this thing cannot be observed, that there was ever something that came without a sufficient cause for itself. Evolution is not just metaphysically and philosophically insane. It's scientifically completely unsupported. And it's just mental. Why don't people understand that you have a gerbil that one day gives birth to a rabbit? They'd say, no, of course not. Yeah. It's gradual changes. Well, show me these freak animals made out of gradual changes, where every single animal is perfect for its telos, for its niche, perfectly designed. We don't see any where if they had to gradually phase from one to the other, they would be dead within days because they're unsuited to anything. And so if you say, well, it's not gradual changes, it's these sudden leaps, punctuated equilibrium or whatever, well, that's just unsustainable because we can't imagine any species giving birth, never mind an ape, giving birth to a rational creature. And I think you said in the video, at just the same time that another one did to a female, or perhaps that wasn't your video.
Yeah.
Are we to believe that Adam and Eve, or whatever they would want to call them, came independently or something just at the right time, or that there was a whole bunch of humans being born by apes and finally 2 met up? It's insane. And so the Bible, in fact, is the fullness of truth. And the more we understand the truth of what God is saying, Jesus about the Holy Eucharist, for example, in John 6 or at the Last Supper, but then the whole of it, including Genesis, I think there is no better explanation for it than to accept it like a child, the young earth creation.
Yes. Well, that's what Marcel Lefebvre, in everyone should pick up a copy of his books, My Spiritual Journey. It's only 75, 80 pages, and it was almost like a last spiritual testament that he wrote, and it was meant for basically what is the spirit of the priesthood, and written in very, he probably wrote by hand, it was written in very easy to understand terms, much like Father's 5-year-old level homilies in Germany. Everyone could understand it. And he touched on this idea of creation. And he said something, the way Lefebvre spoke, he said very little in some ways, but very much in the condensed way that he spoke. And he just said something like, what more can we say? We must just accept Genesis with simple faith, And it wasn't explaining it away. He was just saying, I look at that and I go, these, as Bishop Williamson would say, the scientists, he always makes fun of the scientists in his lectures, they're serious with their white coats and whatever. And I love how he talks about it. But, these very serious people get on podcasts or radio or lectures, whatever, and they have degrees out the wazoo, and they've done calculations out the wazoo, and they show that their theories are metaphysically and mathematically bankrupt, yet they still say there must be a reason why what we're doing is not insane. Whereas a simple child can just read the scriptures and go, oh yeah, God made us. Okay, moving on. It's what else could it be,
The highest science is and has to be theology, and after it is metaphysics, followed by the other philosophies. And to have lost all that again because of the Reformation and detachment from Catholic universities leaves us just floating, so people can assert the crazy theories. And evolution is basically, it's partly political, but very much diabolical to separate us from our creator. It makes the creator distant. And unfortunately, why is it that people think once you have the theory of evolution, you've solved the question of creation, which you haven't even addressed?
No, you haven't.
And you can't. But it gives people that impression because it puts it so far back. Whereas if we believe what the scriptures tell us and the liturgy celebrates, God the Father is so close to us. He's so close. You know, 6,000 years might seem like an awful long time. 2,000 years seems like a long time. But once you learn about, let's say, St. Augustine and St. Odo and then St. Francis Xavier, you've punctuated that at 500-year gaps. It bridges the 2,000 years. And then you learn something about King David and Moses and Abraham, and you're punctuating the time back. So it's through the most human thing for us is to learn other people, to know other people, their lives. And you bridge the whole way back to Adam and Eve with relatively few people and realize that our nature hasn't changed one bit.
Yeah.
They knew love and sorrow and anger, and self-sacrifice. Yeah. And I think that if there is something in your heart ready for self-sacrifice, you will know very quickly, you will recognize who's Jeremiah, for example. And you know you have a close kinship with him, the same father.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so much that could be said there. So I think we should move on, because I wanted to talk about, speaking of, we're so close to the patriarchs, if you think about it. We're just generations removed from our literal first parents. Let's talk about the whole Jewish question. Now, before we do that, I want to preface this because, listen, obviously telling the truth and saying things like it is, that's important. But if we can speak in a way that is delicate to sensibilities and it's more effective in communicating, then we should try to do those things when necessary. Not always possible, but when we can, we should. When I say the Jewish question, I want to explain what I think are two pitfalls that Christians fall into when talking about the Jewish people, the history, and so forth. On the one, I'll call it the sort of neoconservative, Israel is a shining city on the hill. The Jewish people are still, it's the evangelical understanding of the Jewish race, the Jewish people, the Jewish history, as if there's two covenants. Israel is this, the Protestants are, if you watch some of their shows, they're literally hoping for the temple in Jerusalem to be built because they think the rapture is going to come, so they're going to miss out on all the chastisement. It's just foolish, and they're hoping for the end of the world. I watched a clip the other day from the Christian Broadcasting Network. They were talking about, whatever it is, the 4 heifers that have to be there or something like that for the temple. Oh, yeah. And they're like, so-and-so was part of the Evangelical Jewish Alliance, and they're breeding these heifers and hoping to get them to maturity so they can finally use them for the temple. There's plans to build it. I'm thinking, you guys are trying to bring on the end times. You're insane. That's a crazy error, which is sadly, because of the Protestant influence, is not absent in Catholic circles, especially in the sort of neoconservative areas. On the other hand, in the traditional world, and of course we're both traditionalists here, there's a much clearer understanding of the history of Jewish history in the church and in salvation history. But as we all are fallen, sometimes people can fall into a philosophical fallacy when they look at persons as part of a group as if they contain certain immutable characteristics that makes that person intrinsically evil. Right. And that's an error no matter the group. So I want to avoid those two traps, if that makes sense. And I want to still focus on the real importance of understanding the history of the Jews and their current importance in the unfolding of the eschatological ends of the world. And I know this is something that's very important to you. You've talked about it a lot. Could you maybe bring us through that a little bit?
Sure. And I see a very similar tightrope to be walked between two ways of falling off. It's why I left the fraternity and why I've written these 4 books is basically to try and deal with the Jewish question. And why I've had this YouTube channel for a year and a bit, and I've only recently started raising it, doing it very carefully, because the 2 pitfalls as I perceive it. One is if we say that the pandemic is because the Jews want to take over the world, you'll immediately be said, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a nutter. Which in fact dismisses the fact, though, that the Jews themselves say that the Messiah is Israel, who will dominate the world. And it's happening. So we have to be realistic. But the other danger, I think, is I have seen such a hatred of the Jews from a couple of people who are in touch with me electronically. One even put talking of St. Peter, they put saint in like 10 sets of brackets because any silly. Jew, they hate them. And this is someone I think who considers himself Catholic. And it's insane. So my fear is that if it were, I think the Traditionis Custodes can be traced back to Jewish influence. Like we talk of the Protestant influence on the Mass, the Reformation itself is because of Jewish influence, and Jewish academics boast about this. They say how the Jews being expelled from Spain went like so many seeds all over Europe and furthered the Reformation. But if we have some mad self-righteous indignation and think that we didn't crucify Christ by our sins, which we all have, he died for all our sins, and we want to target the Jews with anger and injustice, that's what I'm terrified of. It's just going to be an endless cycle, which suits the devil. The devil wants us to hate each other. And our example from Abel onward, through Abraham and Isaac, through Moses, who was the meekest of all men on the world, then through David, who in Psalm 7 says, "Si feciisted," if I did this thing, if I lifted my hands against my enemy without cause, or against God's anointed, he never hurt God's anointed, Saul, even though Saul, what was always doing was evil. Saul was trying to destroy David. And David, though he had chances to kill Saul, when Saul was sleeping or relieving himself in a cave, David didn't do it. This is preparing us for the example of Jesus Christ, who didn't lift a finger against his persecutors. And then we see St. Stephen did the same thing perfectly, seeing Jesus in heaven, imitated Jesus. And this is how the church lives. And so the exegete who said he had never read the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus, the Jews say, the rabbis teach that the reason God made the universe was to build the tabernacle.
Wow.
So that in the tabernacle, he could meet with us. And yet they don't see that the tabernacle, everything about it is about the body of Christ, the humanity of Christ. So they're right to say God's first idea was the tabernacle, except they don't know what the tabernacle is. Our Lady is also the tabernacle in whom Jesus dwelt bodily. So again, when the saints tell us that Mary is God's first idea, and the rabbis say, no, the tabernacle is God's first idea, in fact, they're so close. The saints are correct. The Jews, if the veil is lifted from their heart, will see it's about Mary, it's about Jesus. And I personally believe that when they convert and start unlocking the scriptures to us, it's going to blow us away. But I love to find in the Torah, so the 4th book in my series is about the conversion of the Jews promised in the Torah. That one will come out at the end of June. And I think I know what I'm doing. But if you have a rabbi who's been studying the Torah all his life, and if he converts and starts to tell us how to find Jesus here, and Mary and the church and the sacrifice of the Mass and the victory over the Antichrist, ironically, it's probable that at that stage, most of the world will have apostatized, which is just...
That's part of the end times predictions and so forth anyway.
They will be so zealous because they'll have this contrition for more than 2,000 years of denying Christ that nothing will shift them from their new faith. Nothing will make them deny Christ. The Antichrist and all his forces, and we can't imagine how strong that power is going to be at the end. But God is preparing his perfect son, victim, weapon against that, which will defeat it. And for some mysterious reason, it involves this long delay and persecution of the church. If people deny that there are enemies of the cross who want to destroy the church, and that this has been happening through all the centuries. The New Testament is full of it, of Judaism, trying to change the doctrine. And then the Gnostic heresies were often Jewish. Arius was a Jew, or a Catholic.
Was he?
He was a
priest.
Know that. He was Jewish background. Of course we don't, because it's all expurged from the history books. You should be accused of being an anti-Semite if you point it out. The Reformation, Luther learned Hebrew. He translated from the Hebrew. He learned that from the Jews. And how is it he has such a hatred of so many Christian books, even in the Bible? Because he's learning it from this source, which is expert in Hebrew, but which has no idea about the meaning of the scriptures, really. So they constantly have this influence, which they can talk about and brag about. But when a Gentile mentions it, you're accused of being a hater. So we're in a topsy-turvy situation. And I think the answer to it is basically shown to us by St. Stephen. He gave I think it's 1,000-word resume in Acts chapter 7 of the whole Old Testament. Not just, he did it by speaking about Abraham, Joseph, and Moses, and then about the temple and idolatry. With these 4, he summarizes the whole Old Testament, and about 10 times in that speech, he shows how it's all about Jesus being rejected by his own, but who on the second visit is successful. And for it, they were furious and killed him, which they've never ceased to do to the church since then. But this whole thing about the second visit is talking about they will convert before our Lord comes. And God would have arranged everything so that history ends perfectly, a complete people for himself.
Well said. Yeah. There's not much more I could add to that. It would be an amazing thing to see someone, even just on a natural level, who has studied the Jewish scriptures in their original, well, as close to the original language understanding as possible, and then have their mind illumined by sanctifying grace. I mean, they'd be automatically the greatest scripture scholar on earth.
Well, St. Paul. That's St. Paul.
That's St. Paul. Yeah.
That's who he is.
Well, and St. Jerome. St. Jerome, I mean, he wasn't a Jew, but he spent so much time in Palestine. And Father Meagher, how we mentioned, who understood the Mass. I mean, the reason why that book is so incredible is because he lived and breathed the closest thing to the ancient culture of the Holy Land still around today. And there's things in his book talking about, they had a festival. They had a festival where, the men would all go squish the grapes in garments that were white, and they'd come out soaked in the blood of the grapes, and then they'd go find a bride. And it's like,
from Mawdsley.
Of course that's what it is, like everything,
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Clarify one point about the scriptures, and I think Tim Flanders wrote a great book about understanding the Old Testament, where he's saying it's very misleading and hard to search for this original text, as if there's this original text, and that the Septuagint, the Greek, is actually what Jesus and most of the New Testament authors would quote from. I find it a complete tragedy in the church now that almost everywhere, and even the Douay Rheims Bible website is beginning to do it, they use the Masoretic numbering for the Psalms. This is much more important than we might think, but the Psalms were written, 150 of them, and then the Septuagint was translated a couple of hundred years before Christ, using these 70 Jewish scholars who came together, who understood the scriptures better than anybody, who gave a perfect translation with 150 Psalms numbered. Then the church fathers would cite this, as well as the New Testament authors. And the church held on to this, and the Vulgate had the same Psalm numbering from St. Jerome. And the church has used that ever since, until the last few decades. What happened? 1,000 years after Christ, the Jews took the scriptures and they decided to give numbers to the Psalms in the Masoretic text, and they numbered them differently. And the first one where there's a split, Psalm 9:10, it's one of these acrostic psalms where the first letter of each line, it goes through the alphabet, or aleph-bet, as it's Hebrew. And they've split that into 2 psalms, which is very unusual. In fact, it makes no sense. They've made a mistake. And as for the other psalms in the 40-something, whatever, to try and make it end up 150, the Biblical Commission said over 100 years ago that there's really, you can argue both ways, who's right, who's wrong. It's difficult. But in that case, why would we change it? When Psalm 9:10 is clearly one psalm, why would we change it? Because the Protestants did. We've now followed the Protestants and the Jews 1,000 years before Christ instead of following the Vulgate and the Septuagint and the New Testament authors. It's a disgrace. So you get now, if you look on the New Advent website, you can read the Fathers and they'll give you a reference to Psalm 22. You go to the section of the Scriptures and it's Psalm 21.
Yes, well, that's always so frustrating.
Nestle Aland Bible, it's a fantastic piece of scholarship. But you look up a reference in the New Testament to one of the Psalms, and it gives you a different numbering to what's in the Old Testament section. So you have this real confusion for nothing, because we have this wrong idea that the Jews understand the Old Testament better than we do because they speak Hebrew. That's false.
Right.
Now, they understand Hebrew better than us, I guess. Well, definitely better than me. They know, they can tell you the Torah off by heart, some of them. But that's like certain Protestants. They can cite chapter and verse, but they can't tell you about Holy Mass or the Virgin Mary. So how can we say they've understood the Scriptures?
Right.
The church has lost her confidence, lost in herself, in the divine revelation, the deposit of faith. And she's chasing after the world, letting the world and the Protestants and ultimately the Jews lead her off that which Jesus and the apostles gave to us. This attempt will fail, but it seems a bit close to the wind right now. And things like the numbering of the Psalms matter. They matter hugely. They're part of our identity. And it's a layer of confusion we don't need. And it's a shame about our history that we have no need to take on.
Well, I just thought of this now. Renumbering of the Psalms is a veiled attack against the Virgin Mary because the Psalter is 150 Hail Marys.
Right.
And
well, they had to, having made one adjustment near the beginning, they had a couple more towards the end to get it back to 150.
Oh, they did. Okay.
Well, there are more Psalms, but it was always, everyone kind of recognized it have to be 150 in the canonical scriptures.
So it's not 151 then in the redone.
There is a Psalm of David, the 151st, but it appears in some, I think, Latin translations, but it's not counted as canonical.
Oh, okay. So I read the Douay Rheims. I think I have it over there. But I've also personally, I've enjoyed reading the Revised Standard Version for study and things. I mean, obviously, my opinion for when people pick a Bible translation, if you're not some sort of language expert, is staying away, is making sure you have the right commentary. So the Revised Standard Version that I have has no commentary. It's like a pocket version. It's like a little zipper bag, and I can fit it in my back pocket. So there's no chance of any sort of modernist notes.
Is that the Catholic edition?
It's the Catholic edition, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually find as well, there's a scripture scholar I like. He talks, and he's Catholic, and he talks about the English Standard Version as actually being a very accurate translation, but he says to stay away from the notes. I don't know if that's true. What do you recommend? Is it just Douay Rheims you would say to people, or yeah? Would you say just Douay Rheims for people?
No, I think it's good to read whatever you're comfortable with, and you grow basically, and then you'll change it. So I find as well that the RSVCE is very readable. Mm-hmm. And when I was in prison in Burma, an immigration guard who was in my interrogation managed to slip me a Protestant Bible, and it blew me away. It was because I hadn't read most of the scriptures for years, and then had nothing else to do in prison but read it. And then when I went back to prison the year after, I made sure I had a Catholic Bible, and I discovered the deuterocanonical books, these 7 extra books. It was awesome. And after that, I thought, how can anyone live without Sirach and Wisdom and Judith and the Maccabees? So as in the seminary, thanks be to God, I had the chance to learn much improved Latin, and then Greek, and then Hebrew. And the more I look into it, the less concerned I am about translations.
I see what you're saying.
It's so nobody's ever going to pin it down with a translation. Yeah. And I don't know if I've said this elsewhere, but Andrew Lloyd Webber he put out a lot of musicals, including Joseph and His Technicolor Dreamcoat in the 1970s. And that's what we had at school when I was a kid growing up. We would do it several times. Fell in love with it. embarrassingly, I would go to London and even watch it on my own several times, this production. It's all about Joseph, right? And there's a scene where these skeletons of sheep come out and claps in the famine. And I'd even start to get emotional thinking, wow, this is speaking of a real famine where people are really starving. Now, there's not one single line in that production from the lyricist Tim Rice, which accords with the line from the Bible. But you get the story of Joseph, who is betrayed by his brothers, thrown in the pit, drawn out, who rises to the top and becomes the savior of the world through giving bread. And they called him the savior of the world and bent the knee to him, which all prefigures Jesus. So even if you completely butcher the lines, the words of the Bible, the text, the translation, and you turn it into Tim Rice lyrics for an Andrew Lloyd Webber production, you still get the main lines that Jesus Christ was thrown into the pit, rose out, comes to the top of the world and saves us, gives us the bread of life. You can't destroy the Bible because the truth of it is written in every layer. I can find 7 layers in the Bible, whether you take the thing as a whole. You have this structure, I'll try and speed up, or a book of the Bible, or a pericope, or a sentence, or a word, or a letter. You have the same story. You know, the letter Tav is the cross, the last letter. Yeah, and the Aleph is the first letter. And in the first word of the Bible, the first sentence, you have this particle in Hebrew, et, Aleph, Tav. Like, what's that? It has no meaning in itself, but it points to the next word being the direct object. But it actually means the Alpha and the Omega.
Right.
And it also means Aleph stands for God, the Spirit, and T, the cross. You have God on the cross.
Right.
This tiny little word has so much meaning in it. And the whole structure of the Bible, if you take Jesus spoke of Moses, the Psalms, and the prophets, which is like basically the book, the law, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings of which the Psalms are the head. 3 massive sections. When the Jews say there's nothing in the prophets which isn't in the Torah, it's like the Father and Son. The Torah is all like the Father. It's about the patriarchs. It's about the law, the foundation, creation. The prophets is all about the Son being murdered for articulating the truth. And yet there's nothing in the prophets that isn't in the Torah. It's like the Father and the Son imaging each other. And the Ketuvim, or the Psalms, is full of these doublets where you get the truth through 2 lines. It's like the Holy Spirit coming from this principle, joint principle of Father and Son. And that's the Old Testament. Then you have the New with the 4 Gospels, which tell us of the life of Christ. Then the book of Acts, and ending with the Apocalypse. Now, the book of Acts is the beginning of the church. The Apocalypse is the end of the church. And everything in between is the life of the church. Paul's epistles, Peter's, Jude's, John's, James's. So it's as if you have the life of Christ, the head, followed by the whole life of the church from beginning to end. And before that was the Holy Trinity. God hidden, unrevealed. We didn't know it's Trinitarian because Jesus hadn't come. And even within the Gospels, you have the 3 synoptics, which can speak of Father, Son, and Spirit, and then St. John's, which is like the incarnate Christ. So the whole Bible on its biggest scale structure tells us about the Trinity, the incarnation, the life of the church. It's amazing.
Wow. You should write a book on the Bible.
Well,
or 4 of them.
I'm trying. That's the fruit of being locked up in prison. People think I'm crazy, right? Because I left the fraternity. I have my reasons, but
let's speak about that, because I wanted to talk about that.
If I can just
sure.
In prison, I got the Bible, and I wrote a book about that, wherein I fell in love with the Jews. And one of my editors told me, it wasn't a professional editor, said, take that line out. You can't put that. And I said, well, it's true. It's true. And for the sake of Moses, I'm not going to take it out. I left it in there. Fell in love with the Jews. And now 25 years later, I think, well, God wanted me to have that time in prison with the Bible. He wanted me to have 40 months solitary confinement the next time with the Catholic Bible, because otherwise I was too stupid to ever read it. I've never got around to reading it. I sympathize with young men now that don't read the Bible because they think they haven't got time. They have their work and their social life. Read the Bible. You have to, or your life is not going to be directed. And God even locked me up to get me to do it. I'm glad. I rejoice for that time.
Excellent. Okay. So you mentioned that you left the fraternity, and we briefly touched on part of it had to do with the Jewish question. I know part of it had to do with your resistance, in my opinion, rightfully so, to the COVID mandate restrictions and things like that. Would you like to explain kind of how that all took place?
Sure. I think the fraternity, as far as I'm concerned, is the best body of priests I know in the church. There might be better ones, but I obviously don't know that many. I'm thoroughly impressed with them. And they're very like the Society of Pius X, I'd say. And I know there's bad blood for obvious reasons, which is kind of, I do see that among the older generation, the bad blood.
I was going to say that it's usually amongst the older ones. I was at the March for Life in Ottawa last year, and fraternity priests, society priests, I mean, sure, different opinions on certain things, but they were both marching in the procession together. It wasn't a big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm the happiest days of my life since childhood were in the seminary in Vigratsbad. And then, in fact, although I loved serving as a priest, it was during the lockdowns that, although it was a terrible, terrible time, the fact that I mean the few of the faithful and myself, we found a way to keep the mass going every day. We never stopped. Even in these fearful lockdowns in Vienna and in Cologne under Merkel. You know, even I think Easter 2021, it's amazing if you can remember the years now, Merkel wanted a new lockdown just for the Easter weekend. It was, she's a witch. That was insane. Yeah. The German businesses wouldn't have it, and even the German bishop stood up to it. But in Vienna, after we got through the lockdown, which Cardinal Schönborn said, you cannot give Holy Communion on the tongue, when they were opening up the churches again. Mm-hmm. Or his chancery said that. Like, I don't know if he personally knows that was said or not, but there's demons in the chancery that saw this as an opportunity to hurt the trads, separate them from Christ, because you can't possibly be such an imbecile that you really believe you're dealing with a health crisis by preventing communion on the tongue. It's just insane to think you can transmit a virus in this way. Yeah. And that to receive on the hand is okay, but the tongue is not, as if the margin means anything. And people have proved anyway it's safer on the tongue, as if it's just not dangerous. And it's our Lord. He's worth it. Some people say, oh, you can't get any disease off the sacred species. I don't think that's true. I think it's just, who cares? You're receiving our Lord.
Exactly. Who cares? Yeah.
So I refused to accept this, and I announced in the homily at the Sunday Mass, for those who wish to receive communion, you can come as normal, because I wanted people to have time to prepare, not to be surprised that suddenly they're receiving communion. And for that, basically, and for saying the message on the lockdown, I was removed from Vienna. Then in Cologne, I was removed because people complained there were too many attending the Easter Triduum. And then in Switzerland, I was told I couldn't offer public masses if I refused to wear the mask to distribute Holy Communion. And of course I refuse. There's an asymmetry here. I don't know anyone that goes taking masks off people. We never wanted anybody to be penalized for wearing a mask. And yet they're strangely willing to take away everything from us if we wouldn't follow this insane behavior. It's cruel behavior to children, irresponsible. It's just an untold damage to their development. So I wasn't looking for a fight here, and I didn't expect to do anything except when I kept being removed from ministry, I took it right on the chin immediately. I didn't argue with my superiors. I said, okay, tell me where to go. I'll go there. I had like 5 months doing nothing, then 8 months doing nothing between these appointments. And then I was told I should read the Epistle and Gospel in the vernacular if I wanted to say a public mass. No way, never.
Like at the altar, you mean?
Yeah. Without saying the Latin.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah.
Straight into the vernacular, wherever, facing the people or the altar, I don't know, but without saying the Latin. I absolutely refuse to do that. We have the missal with the rubrics. We know how it's done, and that's what I was ordained to do. It's like you can't come in after the contract is signed, if we call this a contract where you give yourself to God to be his priest, and this is how you're going to do it. No one can jump in later and say, oh, we're changing that. If they want, it has to be with your consent, as it was with Pius V, right? He said he knows what he's doing. Now, I still would have been willing to have a lifetime of doing without public ministry if it was just for this. if it was just my superiors trying to navigate a way through this very difficult time that the whole world was unsure of itself, because we're being shaken about by Satanists, basically.
Yeah.
It's difficult for the superiors. I get it. They don't want to lose the whole apostolate. They don't want to have bad relations with the cardinal or the bishop. And it's just like there's incredible goods from solitary confinement. So I'm content to sit and study for 5 or 10 or 15 years and just offer private masses, which is the best thing that we do, and pray the office. But then came Traditionis Custodes. And because of that, my next appointment was blocked. Because there's people think Father Mawdsley is a bit of a loose cannon, right? And so you can understand how superiors didn't want me assigned to them. It's difficult for the General House to find a place for me. There's one very good priest in Amsterdam. He said, "Oh, we'll take him." What a great charitable heart he has, brave. And then the bishop there, independent of that, said, "Oh, we're not accepting any new tradi priests," because he wants to conform with TC. And then I thought, okay, now the enemy is so deep within the church, they're attacking the very life of the church now. And it's, to go back to the Jewish question, I think there is a very much a connection with them thinking that Israel is the Messiah, seeking a one world order, and that the pandemic is part of this, although it's not one-to-one, it's not simple. And also the attacks on the traditional mass, which go back to the Novus Ordo, which go back to the Reformation, which go back to the Arianism and the Gnostic heresies and the Judaism we read of in the New Testament, and which go back to everything Jeremiah is writing about, and Cain's attack on Abel. So it's the same story. It's not something we can prove by modern surveillance because we have a recording of a few people who had a meeting and decided this is our plan. It's something you understand when you read history and the scriptures. So enemies of the cross want above all to stop the traditional mass. And I then supposed to sit back and say, well, there's nothing I can do about it? Well, I'm forced then to say, well, I want to address this, but I don't want to address it by saying that the Jews are the adversaries of mankind. Let's hurt them.
Yeah.
St. Paul calls them the adversaries of mankind, but he shows us he never lifted a finger against them. He was trying to kill the Christians. He was trying to destroy the Christians. He converted and never lifted a finger against the Jews. St. Stephen did the same. Jesus did the same. How many examples do we need? With the Reformation, the saints did the same, the martyrs. English martyrs went to the scaffold cheerfully praying for the conversion of their persecutors. St. Edmund Campion, St. Thomas More. This is our lesson, and this is the victory over the devil. He wants us to turn to injustice, to rage, to hate, to greed. So, the usury in the Middle Ages would cripple farmers and communities from the Jews taking their money. And that's why often the local community would turn to a pogrom in which they wanted to burn the books. It's not that they wanted to steal the wealth back. They wanted to burn the books which had all the ledgers and their debts in them. These debts were unjust.
Right.
But you can see from any excess or anger or injustice that was done, we all suffer under that now because you have this false narrative that the church is anti-Semitic, which is complete BS.
It's false.
The church is a Jewish being in that it's the body of Christ. He's Jewish, given birth to from the Virgin Mary, who's Jewish. All the first apostles, all the apostles are Jewish. The church's beginning is Jewish and her end will be Jewish. But she's Jewish and Gentiles. We're both in there now. So it seems like a long shot. I no longer hope for the healing of the hierarchy with Francis and our bishops. It's over with them. We have to be really realistic. It's over. They want to bless homosexual activity in church sanctuaries, in liturgical books. It's already happening. The Germans are bragging about doing this. The Belgians have posted on their bishop's website a text which they claim is liturgical for this. It's over with these people. And God, of course, by a work of God can rescue them. But if we're saying we have to work with them, negotiate with them, well, people can try that, but they're not being realistic. I think it's far more realistic to pray for the conversion of the Jews, and who are behind both the worldly problems and the church problems. And when they convert, it will heal it. And to pray for their conversion, I don't just mean through your pious private prayers. I mean the Good Friday prayer for the conversion of the Jews, the old traditional one. It is perfect and it is powerful. And if we try to get that prayer back, it will bring us into conflict with any enemy standing in the way, including in the church. All those who try to stop that they're not with the program. They might be of goodwill. It's very possible. But they need to understand that a life is in tradition. If we drop the ball, there's no hope for the future, and everything in the past was futile. It's about a lot more than our generation. It's not a selfish thing because we find the traditional mass smells beautiful because of the incense and we like the sound of the bells and the look of the vestments. That's not it. This is, like we said before, it's about the cosmos. The whole cosmos is engaged. And the very effort to get the pre-55 liturgy, which requires a bit of study and sacrifice and understanding, that will make us into the Catholics we're supposed to be, who are fearless, who love God above all things, who value the saints, who know we're doing this even for our enemies. And then we would thereby restore the whole liturgy, which, as you know, is the beginning of having the right faith and the right moral life. So whether or not the Jews convert, that's in God's hands, right? We can't make it happen, but we can pray for it, which is our duty. And if we pray for it, it certainly will happen when God's ready. If we let it go, then I think we're stuffed. We're going to fall to the groomers, basically, who we see that physically, sexually happening, but it's a spiritual thing behind it from the devil. What clerics do to altar boys is what the devil wants to do to all our souls.
Right.
We can't allow that. And that's not obedience. It's not obedience. It's not meekness and humility to submit oneself to that.
Okay. That brings me to, I think, the last thing we'll talk about today. This is amazing. If you please come on again, by the way, because I feel like we could both get ourselves canceled happily on YouTube. So at the Catholic Identity Conference, you did talk about resisting Pope Francis until it hurts. And I think we've spoken at length about the importance of resisting here to a degree. And you mentioned now that the hierarchy is basically a lost cause, and I tend to sympathize, if I'm being honest. But you did also do a video last year about the Society of St. Pius X and Marcel Lefebvre. One of the most beautiful and heartwarming things I've seen anyone say about Lefebvre, and obviously everyone knows I'm a Lefebvre partisan. I have a book coming out. I'm actually just waiting on my final blurb. So Father so-and-so, who I'm waiting for my blurb. If you haven't finished it, please send it to me so I can put it on the back cover and get that thing out hopefully next week. And it's in defense of Marcel Lefebvre and the SSPX. It's called SSPX The Defense, so it's very on the nose what it's about. But you said basically, the analogy you gave, which I thought was so beautiful, it actually inspired me to write an essay for 1 Peter 5 about the same topic.
That was a great essay. I enjoyed that as well.
Thank you. And it was about, at the crucifixion, the whole hierarchy had left, except for one bishop who stood there with Mary Magdalene and Blessed Mother. And so if we see the church going through her passion, which clearly she is, at least one of the, if there's one, I don't know, but there's a passion going on. And we saw one bishop basically, or at least one man of a few, but the one who represented any resistance that any bishop could give was Marcel Lefebvre to what was happening. And you mentioned, for example, why you would not say the prayers or the read the readings in the vernaculars, because you said that's not in the contract. That's not what I signed up for. That's essentially the argument Marcel Lefebvre gave. Is like, you can't tell me I can't say the same ordination or same prayers over my chalice as I said at my ordination. That's not what I was ordained to do. Can you speak to what caused you to sort of change your mind about Lefebvre and your understandings of obedience and things like that?
Right. I remember after giving that analogy about St. Peter fleeing and St. John staying, who I think in a way, St. John, although he is an apostle and a bishop, he stands for the priesthood. And
Right.
Archbishop Lefebvre was very much for the priests, right? Keep the priests existing. And he achieved that, by the way, for all of us. And some gentlemen on the internet who are, I can't remember their names, but they like to attack the SSPX. They said that I have no understanding of the scriptures or something because St. Peter wasn't yet the Pope.
Yeah.
Because Peter wasn't the Pope. And I thought, oh, you poor men, do you not know that the author of the scriptures can anticipate the future? This is the whole point of typology. He can lay something into someone's life, even in the New Testament, which speaks of the future. It doesn't matter that Peter wasn't yet Pope. But in any case, the thing that there were two things that turned my mind around about the SSPX. One was previously I'd never really accepted the argument that we're in a state of emergency. I always thought, no, there's always a way through. Things are grim, but there's always a way through. But frankly, when I've been told in what I thought was one of the last safe places in the church to keep tradition, that I have to start doing things which are against the rubrics and making the Mass into a circus with various...
all the COVID mandate stuff. Yeah.
And then we see Traditionis Custodes and this blatant attempt now where they've put Francis in that document. The goal is that we're all going to go to the Novus Ordo. It's just a matter of when. Well, this is an emergency. And Archbishop Lefebvre just saw it coming decades before me and a lot of others. We have to admit he was right.
Yeah.
And when I was in Switzerland, and for 8 months, I'm saying Mass pretty much on my own all the time, every day. Very rare that people could come to my Masses there. I have to enter into the Mass in a deeper way to do that, because I love it when the faithful are present, of course. I know that the Mass of a priest alone is still the highest worth of anything on earth. But you can't help loving it when people are coming to that. In fact, one beautiful thing in the lockdowns is we're saying Masses in tiny chapels in people's homes. People who were coming regularly said, and I have heard recently similar, they've never been so close to the altar. They've never seen such things. And it touches people deeply. It changes their whole life. And so I, even though before I began seminary, I thought the Mass is the greatest thing on the planet because you've read the theology books. And even though when I was ordained, I believed it more, it really has hit me in a whole new level, which I've tried to explain in that Crucifixion to Creation. And I failed, I think, to begin to say why the Mass is so good. And Archbishop Lefebvre knew this. Yeah. He knew that if we don't keep the traditional Mass, it's over. It's really over. He's done it for the whole church. And he took all the flack and accusations, all the injustices from Rome, which he took like a saint. And his work has been so fruitful. And I don't buy that the 12 founders of the fraternity and the seminarians came with them. I don't think they betrayed him. I think they see things differently with canon law and whatever, and that they were of goodwill. And I think God can use that division even now to his providential game plan, where he does have people who are closer to the bishops and other who are under them but more independent in some of their operations. So the bishops find it very hard to shut tradition down. It's not simply invite the fraternity in and that will destroy the SSPX. It doesn't work like that. Both places will grow. I think the priests who, I know fraternity priests preach hard against the SSPX in some places in the States. They've really stop it. Look, the world's huge. There's 8 billion souls. You're not in competition with any Catholic priest. You're in competition with the devil who wants to take souls to hell. So preach against him and not against priests who are offering the traditional Mass. Right. Lefebvre, it's amazing what he did. And I'm sorry that I wrote him off and spoke against the... What's changed me is meeting faithful who go to SSPX Masses and then meeting SSPX priests and then reading his autobiography and reading his writings about they have unthroned him.
That's the magnum opus. They have uncrowned him. Is everyone? That is one of the greatest books I've ever read in my life. It is so rich.
And there are problems with sexual abuse within the society. It's everywhere, and that needs to be exposed prosecuted, dealt with, like everywhere. But that can't be a bludgeon to try to destroy the good of the Archbishop and the whole society and the prayers of the faithful there.
Yeah, well said. It does astonish me now, still to this day. You know, I'm finishing my final edit on this book, and there are plenty of examples in church history of bishops and priests disobeying superiors, even the Pope, in times of grave necessity. It's very rare. When I say plenty, I say, half a dozen, but there have been kind of half a dozen moments where something like that was necessary. And thankfully it's extremely rare. Just regarding the consecrations very quickly, you've probably referenced The Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma by Ludwig Ott. I mean, it's an exceptional book that's been used to form priests. It's very clear in that book that it wasn't the norm to have explicit papal approval for consecrations of bishops until about a few hundred years ago. And it's just said as it's an afterthought. It's just, well, this is the way it was for a long time. Basically, the point is, clearly, obviously, we have the laws of the church and we have to make every attempt to follow those positive laws. But the highest law is the salvation of souls. And as we've said, and as you've said so rightly in this show together, the preservation of the traditional Mass it's not just about the smells and bells are important, because we're incarnational. We have to smell things. We have to taste things. That's not just a throwaway. Nonetheless, the traditional Mass is the sustenance of creation.
Yeah. And
we cannot throw that thing away. And it's worth, as you said, resisting until it hurts. Yeah. It's worth being calumniated. And I'll say one last thing here about Lefebvre. I was talking to some friends earlier in a group chat, and my friend mentioned, I can't remember where it was, but there's something came up, and he said, pretty much everyone who hate each other somehow all come together and hate Lefebvre. And he said, that's almost Christ-like. And I said, yeah, the same people that will never sit in the same bar together will share a cup and cheers their drinks in hatred of Lefebvre. It's very strange. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Father, we've talked for almost 2 hours. We could talk for 5 more, but I know it's late where you are, and my children are about to come home. My poor wife is going to need some help. And real quick, where can people find your work so that they can support you?
There's either through the YouTube channel, Scripture and Tradition, Father JM, which links to all those books. And it's really by reading the books, getting this idea about the Old Testament and the New. That's what I'm trying to put out there. And that's why some people say to me, why don't I join this society or that institute or this fraternity? The things I'm going to be saying in a couple of months, no society will want me to be a member, right? And that's what I mean about resist until it hurts. I want to be in a parish. I want to be doing all that. I don't have faculties. I don't have canonical mission. There's different arguments for different groups, but I don't have it. I'm not trying to do those things. There's a subtle difference here that people don't get. I've had things taken away from me. I'm not attempting to grab them or replace them. I think, okay, I'll say the Mass in office. I'll write some books and study the Scriptures and pray for the conversion of the Jews. Who can speak against that? That's my plan. And I want to try and encourage other people to pray for the conversion of the Jews and read the books to understand why and how, and get to the traditional Mass. And I would love honest feedback on the books. If people read Adam's Deep Sleep or the Virgin Mary's Crushing the Antichrist's Head and they don't see what I'm saying, they don't agree this is in the Old Testament. I mean, Catholics who read the book with goodwill and don't see it, tell me where I'm failing. Maybe I need to go back with my tail between my legs and say, I'm sorry, I'm a lunatic. I take all these books down and I'm not going to wear the mask, but and I'm not going to say the Novus Ordo ever. But this is the plan. And when the 4th book comes out, we will see.
What's the 4th book called?
If you believe Moses.
Okay.
That's about the conversion of the Jews promised in the Torah. In fact, the whole Bible.
Wow. I can't wait. Okay. Well, Father, it's the octave of Easter, so I didn't even say this, but happy Easter. Yeah. And we'll speak soon, and I'm sure you'll be back on. This is going to be a hit with the viewers of the show. I can imagine. This episode is going to turn into 7 or 8 15-minute segments that I'll put out as other episodes because there's just so much depth that we talked about here. And wonderful. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to Father Mawdsley, and this has been the Kennedy Report, and until next time, God bless.